Picture this. You're by the East Aegean Sea at night. Thousands of armed men are asleep beside their ships. You're thankful for the cool night air, but anxious about what tomorrow brings. You're 10 years deep into the Trojan War, and you need to win victory soon because you are desperate to return home. You've felt the clash of battle. You've seen the splash of red-hot blood on the sand. You've even heard the crash of thunder and seen lightning bleach the sky, a warning from the warring gods of Mount Olympus who are divinely invested in your mortal affairs. But you've grown tired of the macho posturing of warrior men who seem more concerned about fighting each other than successfully sacking Troy and restoring the Queen of Sparta to her kingdom. Now, the endless siege will result in success for the Greeks, but then you will be faced with the voyage from hell and the journey of a lifetime as you strive to get back to your family in Ithaca. It's 10 years of fighting, followed by 10 years of striving to return home, because every obstacle is thrown in your way. You will face a seductive sorceress, a wrathful cyclops, ravenous cannibals, sirens whose singing is deadly, a six-headed monster, a fatal whirlpool, and the storms of gods. And when you do finally return home, you will then have to contend with a horde of pesky suitors who have been planning to murder your son and trying to move in on your wife. You've just heard the story of the two sublime epic masterpieces that are the foundation for all of Western literature and the bedrock for our civilization and thought. Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. These awe-inspiring, inexhaustible and endlessly influential works about the rage of Achilles and the homecoming of Odysseus are the crown jewels of great literature. And sustaining a deep, lifelong reading of Homer, who gives us incredibly valuable wisdom literature, will unlock the power of every other literary titan you come to, from Ovid to Dante to Chaucer to Shakespeare to Joyce. These epic sagas are almost 3,000 years old, and yet they continue to speak powerfully and perennially to the human condition. Alexander the Great famously kept a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow, along with a dagger, when he was on military campaigns, because he saw the work as a sacred blueprint for heroism. But it wouldn't be a bad idea for you and I to do something similar. Indeed, my bedside table permanently stations my battered copies of Homer's epics alongside the plays of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. Readers in every age have found healing, courage and inspiration in these epics. And which epic resonates the most with you, the Iliad or the Odyssey, typically depends on what your life looks like right now and what you need. If the Iliad captures you, then it's because you need to tap into your inner hero and you need to gather the resolve to fight on. If the Odyssey moves you, then that is likely a sign that you're tired of the fighting and you need to return home in your heart. You need a little bit of healing. And it's interesting that different times, different eras will actually favour one epic over the other, depending on what the world needs at that moment in time. The Iliad, for example, a book about war and rage, was really popular in the boring age of Victoria, whereas the modern world, with its nihilistic machine world warfare, felt itself pulled back to the Odyssey with its striving to return home. Given the fact that today there are twice as many reviews for the Odyssey as there are the Iliad, I think we can tell that now we are in desperate need of some homecoming. But not only is the high poetry of Homer instructive and profound, but the Iliad and the Odyssey are, above all, thumping good adventure reads. These are thrilling stories that grab you by the collar and don't let go. They are romantic narratives that mesmerise and delight just as profoundly as they teach and inspire. These epics have everything in them. They have the tragic, the comic, and the mythic. And these stories are rendered with incredible visual power and supreme oral majesty. They meditate sublimely on love, hate, pride, and heroism, and so much more. And they are also filled with some of the most iconic characters and astonishing set pieces in all of literature. And today, as we are now kicking off an exclusive and brand new lecture series for the epics of Homer at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, which is at patreon.com/hardcore literature, I would like to talk to you about how you can really bring yourself to these epics and how you can suck the marrow right out of them. We're going to talk about who Homer was. We'll talk about the classical epic tradition, oral storytelling, myth versus history, the best translations of Homer, and much more. And let's begin by asking a simple question with a complex answer. Who was the man we call Homer? That is the Homer question, and endeavouring to answer this question takes us into the composition of the epics themselves and the ancient Greek oral storytelling tradition. Now, you've got two main theories and two schools of thought when it comes to who Homer was. One, you've got the unitarians, who contend that Homer was a real person and an individual. He was a blind bard who lived in the 9th or 8th century BCE and was a native to Ionia, a region on the western coast of Anatolia, which is now part of modern-day Turkey. Unitarians believe that the Odyssey and the Iliad were products of a single genius mind. And then the second school of thought is that of the analysts, who believe that Homer was actually a group of people, or the name Homer is like a convenient shorthand for a tradition. And many contend that the epics are patchworks created by multiple earlier songs and then compiled at a later date. And the analysts believe that these epics evolved over many generations. They came to be how we know them today after being passed down through the oral storytelling and performative tradition. These stories were kept alive, they were spoken, they were performed long before they were written. They would finally be written down in the 6th century BCE. Now, proponents of this theory point to the structural and thematic divergences in these epics to suggest that they were not of the same creative mind. It's interesting to note that some believe that the Iliad and the Odyssey were products of a single genius, but it was a different genius for each epic. We can see that the Odyssey is intensely self-aware. It is very conscious of the fact that it comes as a sequel to the Iliad, and the Odyssey, the writer, the poet, the bard of the Odyssey takes great delight in filling in the backstory, what happens in the gap of time between the epics. And it's in the Odyssey that we get these incredible embedded character narrators who explain some of the most iconic images and episodes around the Trojan War. The Trojan horse, for example. We don't actually get to see that in the Iliad, but we get told about it in the Odyssey. This is true as well for the death of Achilles. The poet of the Odyssey fills us in for all of this. And there is a more detailed account of the fall of Troy in Virgil's Aeneid. And so from beginning to end in the Odyssey, we get this consistent, overt, metafictional awareness about the act of storytelling itself. But not only that, there's also a very different tone and quality and substance to each of the epics. If you read them in sequence, in swift succession, you will recognise the characters, but the voice will sound rather different. Now, Longinus, writing on the Sublime, would say that the love of romance that comes through in the Odyssey reflects the idea that Homer wrote this epic as an epilogue in advancing old age. For as we grow older, we grow more nostalgic and more romantic in our outlook. Now, I do agree with Longinus on that. We can see that's definitely true for William Shakespeare, for example. In the Odyssey, Longinus said, "One may liken Homer to the setting sun. The grandeur remains without the intensity." And he would say that the Odyssey is more like a proto-comedy of manners and like a picaresque series of character sketches than the sublime offering we get in the Iliad. He would contend that the Iliad was written by a much younger man in the heyday of his genius, which would make the entire piece lively with dramatic action. So maybe the writer of the epics was the same man, but there was a difference in age and he wrote them at very different stages in his life. Now, Samuel Butler famously put forward the theory that the Odyssey was in fact written not by a man, but by a Mediterranean woman. And this would partially inspire Harold Bloom's theory that one of the writers of Genesis was a woman of the Solomonic court. Though this theory is widely dismissed, I can't help but feel as though Butler's assertion is not without cause. Indeed, I read the Odyssey and I read Genesis with the same feeling that I get come through when I read the tale of Genji. I have a feeling that these are the three most sublime offerings from women in world literature, and fully 2/3 of them are assumed to be written by men. You read the Odyssey, and yes, the epic takes a man as its central protagonist, but the work is absolutely bursting with women's voices and the concerns of women. This is all the more arresting and vibrant when you read it right after the Iliad, which has a brutal, bloodthirsty masculinity come through. But that's the romantic in me. The romantic wants to believe that the Odyssey was written by a woman. Now, the pragmatist in me sides with the analysts over the unitarians, and I do believe that Homer is more institution than man. Was there a singing bard, a genius whose originating voice gave us these epics? Almost certainly. And I'm absolutely not a proponent of embracing the modern fad that dispenses with the idea of individual genius and reads great writers as the product of socio-historical cultural forces, because indeed single genius is the reason why we read William Shakespeare and not Thomas Dekker and George Peele. But that's not what we're saying exactly when we call Homer an institution. Although I definitely believe there was a bard and an originating voice, is what we have today in the epics the product only of that single daimonic voice? Definitely not. These epics are the layered outcome of endless tellings and retellings, and many Homeric scholars embark on quixotic quests through variant manuscripts in search of authentic lines that surely were original to the one we think we know as Homer. Without a doubt, the epics that we have today are the product of a collaborative endeavour. It's worth bearing in mind when you read Homer that the epics were originally sung. They weren't read, they were sung to audiences around the 8th century BCE, though the stories and oral culture goes back many centuries earlier than that even, and they wouldn't be written down until 150 to 200 years later in the 6th century BCE. Evidence shows that the texts would be standardised for recitation by rhapsodes at Greek theatrical festivals. The authorship debate raged right up until the early 20th century, when in the 1920s and 30s, a classicist called Milman Parry would revolutionise our understanding of the Homeric epics. Parry would become known as the Darwin of Homeric studies, and his protégé, Albert Lord, would also exert enormous influence on Homeric scholarship with his deeply insightful the singer of tales. These researchers would tell us that we cannot answer the authorship question without first penetrating into the oral performative culture and finding out how the epics were originally brought to life. Parry and Lord proposed a theory that the epics were part of a very, very long oral tradition and were composed in the process of performance itself. This is the theory of oral formulaic composition. So they weren't written and then performed, they came to be in the act of performance. This is a theory that we take for granted today, but it was revolutionary. And as part of their research, they conducted fieldwork in the Balkans, primarily in Yugoslavia, and they made recordings of South Slavic oral epic singers called guslars, and they analysed Serbo-Croatian poetry, and they would note that the composition of sung narratives was not fixed. This form is intensely malleable and flexible, and it is told dynamically in performance. Think of a jazz musician. What do jazz musicians do? Yes, there is a structure, but they riff, they improvise, they let loose, and they just enjoy being in the moment and coming up with a new twist on an old song. And that is why in the jazz arena you will not hear the same song performed exactly the same way twice. This was true for Homer and his contemporaries too. And we see that this remains true all the way through to the medieval English and French traditions. We see that this would have been the case for works like Beowulf and the Song of Roland. And the performers were travelling bards. They would travel from province to province in the time of ancient Greece. They would recite the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so that means their ability to memorise was absolutely integral to the performance, to their success. And how do you memorise long epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey? It's worth bearing in mind that the Iliad has well over 15,000 verses, the Odyssey has well over 12,000 lines. What you need to do is you need the work to have rhythm and rhyme and compelling sounds and repetition. You need familiar epithets and stock phrases. When you read Homer's epics, you will likely notice two repetitive stylistic things. One, when a character is described, there is very little variation in how they are described. They are always pretty much described in the same way. This is true for aspects of nature too. For example, Achilles is swift-footed Achilles. Athena is owl-eyed, or the grey-eyed goddess. Hera is white-armed. Agamemnon is the kingly king. You'll see this repeated. Poseidon is the earth shaker. And when the men set sail upon the sea is the wine-dark sea. And when morning comes, we see rosy-fingered dawn pretty much every time. So that's one repetitive thing you'll notice. Another repetitive thing is that when a character is told something at length, they typically will go and repeat what they have been told almost word for word to somebody else. For example, we see in the Iliad that Zeus comes down to the dreaming Agamemnon and he gives him some plans to attack the Trojan camp. It's a bit of misdirection. He tells him what to do, and then Agamemnon wakes up and he springs up and he goes and he tells his men pretty much word for word what Zeus has just said. We see this all of the time, and first-time readers might dislike this lengthy repetition. They might find it to be extraneous and wonder why it is included at all. Why was it not cut out? But personally, if I were ever to do a film adaptation of these epics, do you know what I would do? I would keep every repetition in. I would film every single line. Every single thing on that page would be a scene on the screen. And so a film adaptation in that sense would include a lot of repetition. I think it's absolutely integral to its effect, but it had a very practical and pragmatic purpose for the original bards, the singers of the tales. That repetition allows the poet to have a space to recall the next part of the story. Whilst they're retelling what they've just said, they're thinking about where the narrative is going to go next. And Milman and Parry would tell us that the poetic formulas used in these epics, the repetition of meter, pitch, syntax, structure, all of this, they would say that these formulas are practically mathematical and they provide oral hook points for the one bringing the story to life. Not only that, but it is feasible that there was another bard among the audience who would be taking this all in and remembering the story. And of course, you could then share that story and carry it with you. And it really is amazing what you can remember when you make use of poetry. Meter is the vehicle for narrative and character and shared history and myth and culture. But of course we see that not all poetry is alike despite their commonalities. The poetry of a nation and a time will depend significantly upon the language. Now, Ezra Pound would cite ancient Greek as the most musical, the most melodic and melopeic of all the languages, and he would say that the Greeks charged their language with meaning through sound, as opposed to, say, the poetry of the Chinese poets. That's primarily visual, or the poetry of the English poets. English poets are primarily metaphorical. And Pound would also remind us that the further a poem strays away from the condition of song and dance, the more it decays. So bear in mind that when you read Homer, or you read almost any ancient Greek poetry or theatre, the reading experience is not how the original audience, the original recipients of these tales would have experienced it. Not at all. It's meant to be sung. And the breadth of ancient Greek prosody is that of dactylic hexameter. If you know your meter, you'll know what that means. Ancient Greek poetic meter is based on duration of sounds. This is quite different from English. English is based on syllabic accentuation. So when we read Chaucer or Shakespeare or Milton, we see that the bread and butter meter for English is 5 beats per line. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Iambic pentameter. When we read Homer, we find 6 metrical feet per line, with each foot made up of 1 long and 2 short syllables. And typically the line ends on 2 long syllables. This is known as a spondee. So you have this unwinding, song-like, mellifluous saga of a line that ends almost like a battle drum, a war drum being sounded at the end. Now, we don't need to get into the weeds with this at this time, but suffice it to say that this poses one of the central problems when it comes to translating Homer. We'll talk about translation shortly. This is a problem because the two traditions sound very different from one another. If you want an example of a more Homeric sound in English, then we can look to the poetry of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who imitated the classical epics in his poem Evangeline. And this sounds really beautiful. It goes like this. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks, bearded with moss and in garments green, indistinct in the twilight. We have very few natural spondees in English because we always end up pretty much giving preferential stress to one syllable over another, but I think Longfellow gets very close here. But the fact of the matter is, dactylic hexameter is not suited to English at all, and that's why Victorian poet laureate Matthew Arnold, in his lecture on translating Homer, would advocate for using English heroic verse instead, because that would properly get across the nobility of Homer, and trying to actually replicate the Greek meter in English would only sound clumsy. But anyways, it's important to acknowledge the importance of having a robust memory for the original singers of these tales, so they could remember the characters and the episodes, but they would give it its own unique twist in their telling, in performance. The bards, who were known in ancient Greece as the aoidoi, which means singers, we see would open their epics with a direct appeal to the muse. This is an epic convention. beginning the story with an imploration for divine inspiration. Inspire me and aid me in telling the story. In fact, use me as a vessel, a channel, and sing through me. Let's look at the openings of both of Homer's epics, and let's look with the Stanley Lombardo translation. Here's the Iliad. It begins. Rage, sing, goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds, as Zeus's will was done. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and godlike Achilles. Which of the immortals set these two at each other's throats? So notice the very first word of this epic, rage. Now, that's a mnemonic right there. That's also this poem's thesis statement. That's what the poem is about, and indeed if we could sum up the Iliad in just one word, it would be rage, it would be wrath, or it would be anger. So that's a mnemonic, because when all else fails, all the poet really needs to do is remember the poem is about rage, and we're told it's about the rage of Achilles, but indeed we see over the course of the Iliad that we're dealing with the rage of many different characters, divine and mortal. This epic is a meditation on rage in all its forms: righteous anger, unrighteous anger, anger as a result of pride, the cost of anger, and how to ameliorate it, how to heal from anger, how to channel your anger. It's all about anger. Anger absolutely saturates this epic and also gives it its colour. I believe that these epics have their own tone, they have their own colour, and the colour of the Iliad to me is red. The colour of the Odyssey is blue. It's bathed in blue. But one of the many things that makes this epic is the fact that the subject matter is sublime. It is about the human condition at scale. Rage in all its forms and at its heights. So that's the emotional key and colour, and it's worth bearing in mind as well that in the Greek, the first word is rage, but it's a very specific kind of rage. The first word is meanness, and that is typically used for describing the rage of the gods. Here, and only here, it's used to describe the rage of the godlike but mortal Achilles. And then notice the second word. This is really important too. Sing. So this is an imperative, it's an instruction, a plea, a prayer to the goddess above. The poet is trying to tap into their creative spirit, and they want the divine force that gives life to story to work through them. And who is the goddess being appealed to here? Whilst not explicitly named, the classical tradition assigns epic poetry to the goddess and muse Calliope. She was one of 9 muses, and it's worth bearing in mind that the mother of the muses is the titaness Mnemosyne. Notice the etymology, that's where we get our word mnemonic, a memory aid. So, memory is the mother of the muses. And who are the other muses, the other daughters of memory? Well, to name a few, beside the muse of epic poetry, you also have Clio, that's the muse of history. You've got a muse for tragedy, a muse for comedy, a muse for hymns. And so all these human endeavours, history and tragedy and comedy and epic poetry, are nothing without memory. They cannot come into the world without memory. Memory is so important, and this is why the ancients were rightfully obsessed with memory. It is the foundation of human civilization. It's thanks to memory that these stories survived. Without memory, how would these stories have been constantly disseminated and passed around before they were written down? And it's worth bearing in mind that the memory techniques pioneered by the ancients continue to be very powerful today. I've personally used the Palace of Loci, the memory palace, to help me through my final exams back in university. What you do with that is you take abstract notions and you make them concrete and visual, and you put them in a familiar surrounding. You map them out in your mind's eye, and you take a little tour through a familiar locale. It's a great technique. So the poem's about rage, and we get an imploration to sing, and we're told very early on who the poem is about. It's about Achilles, because great epic poetry isn't just about something, they're about someone, they're about people, they're about the striving, legendary, heroic figures, great heroes of antiquity. And from the start we also get a synopsis of what's to come. And the poet is conversant with the muse and asks a question. It's a rhetorical question that the poet answers themselves. Who of the immortals started this quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles? I do this too, I do this in my talks. Like I've said today, who was Homer? That's a memory technique. It gives you a little bit of a space to get to the next part of the talk. It's very, very useful. But let's turn to the Odyssey. Now, how does the poet begin this one? Notice again, I posed another question there. I posed it to you, I posed it to myself, I posed it to my memory. This is not for you to answer, it's a signpost for me. It gives me time and space to get to the next leg of our discussion. The Odyssey begins. Speak memory. That's how Lombardo translates it. Speak memory of the cunning hero, the wanderer, blown off course time and again after he plundered Troy's sacred heights. Speak of all the cities he saw, the mines he grasped, the suffering deep in his heart at sea, as he struggled to survive and bring his men home, but could not save them. Hard as he tried, the fools, destroyed by their own recklessness when they ate the oxen of Hyperion the sun, and that god snuffed out their day of return. Of these things speak, immortal one, and tell the tale once more in our time. Though Lombardo chooses to begin his translation with the word speak, in the Homeric original, the very first word is andra, and that means man. We want to know about the man who was blown off course, and of course, even though he doesn't get a name right away, that is Odysseus. It's significant that he's not named overtly just yet. His reputation precedes him, but this is also a poem about identity as well. So Achilles is the focal point character for the Iliad, and Odysseus is the focal point for the Odyssey. And the original imploration is to the muser, to the muse, but still the appeal to memory is implicit in that. And look at how the poet is simultaneously gathering himself or herself up to tell the story, reminding themselves of the important story beats to hit, and also at the same time exciting their audience by peppering in some key events to look forward to. Another really interesting facet to note is the appeal for the muse to tell the tale once more in our time. So this is not a telling, it is a retelling. And the audience is very familiar with this story. They have already heard these stories countless times, and this is why these epics are able to start in medias res, in the middle of things. Just like in life, we're thrown into life in medias res and we have to learn to catch up. But this isn't a difficulty for the ancient audience because they know the story. So you can start wherever you feel is the most sublime place to start, the most exciting place. The poet, the bard, the singing teller of tales assumes a lot of knowledge on the part of the listeners. But even if you don't have any knowledge, you're caught up to speed quite quickly, and there's a lot of repetition, so you do get familiar with who's who and what's gone on very swiftly. And keep in mind that the notion of spoilers or spoiler warnings wouldn't have been a thing in ancient times. That is a very modern concern. For most of history, novelty was not high on the list of things that audiences wanted. It was only really when we started to see the rise of the novel, which of course, novel means new. It was only around then that we see demands for new stories. But we could contend that there isn't really anything new under the sun when it comes to literature. Indeed, we can look at Shakespeare, for example, and we can see that he only wrote 2 original stories, and everything else was a derivation. Everything else was inspired by other storytellers, Chaucer, Ovid, Plutarch, and so on. And so in Shakespeare and in Homer alike, you know how the story is going to end right from the beginning. Romeo and Juliet, for example, begins and says, hey, these two are going to die. So you spend the entire play waiting for that, anticipating that. And similarly, the Odyssey opens and says, hey, the entire crew is going to die. Odysseus is going to strive to keep them safe as he tries to get home, but he's not going to be able to do that ultimately. So we know that things are going to take quite a dire turn, or indeed many dire turns. This is a narrative full of twists and turns. And we know that Odysseus's crew are going to die due to their own recklessness. He even names the episode in which they are finished off, so we're waiting for that. You can still have suspense in Homer. As you are awaiting the inevitable, you're feeling fate draw ever nearer. And knowing what's going to happen and having it delayed creates dramatic tension. Now, I read Homer as a really suspenseful writer, personally, but this is an anachronistic reading, this is a modern imposition. Auerbach would contend in his Mimesis, he has an incredible chapter called Odysseus' Scar. He would contend, actually, that the element of suspense is very slight in the Homeric poems. Nothing in their entire style is calculated to keep the reader or hearer breathless. The digressions are not meant to keep the reader in suspense, but rather to relax the tension. Now that's very interesting, the idea of having a little relax, a little pause. I cannot help personally but to read these as very suspenseful narratives, but I believe Auerbach is correct, and the bards would use these periods of downtime to recollect and get to the next leg of the story. And what's really fascinating about both epics is that our central protagonists are both away from the narrative for a significant gap of time. In the Iliad, we know that Achilles is going to cut down countless Trojans at the Battle of Troy, and he's going to help the Greeks finally secure long-awaited victory. So when he absents himself from the epic for the bulk of the story, because he does, we meet him at the beginning, they have the quarrel, him and Agamemnon, and then he withdraws, and we don't see him properly, we don't see him in action until right near the end. I believe that gives us a mounting, building tension. Maybe tension's not the right word, anticipation, but it's delightful. So when he does return to battle, it is a really rewarding feeling. We are desperate for him to return, and then we embrace him when he does. The same thing is true for the Odyssey. The Odyssey does not actually begin or open properly with Odysseus. We are expecting his story from the title. The title of the Iliad means the story of Troy. Troy is Ilios or Ilion, and the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus. But we begin famously with the Telemachia, and we begin with the story of his son, Telemachus. We get this incredible foregrounding where we see what life is like without him back home in Ithaca. We see the suitors are moving in on his wife and what they're doing, their misbehaviour whilst he's away. So when he finally returns home, we are desperate for him to take out the trash. We're desperate for him to right the wrongs that have been done in his absence. And that means we get an incredible payoff, an incredible climax. It's very hard, even for the greatest writers of all time, to deliver a compelling climax. Shakespeare couldn't always do it. Many of his endings are kind of rushed. He just ties up loose ends and then leaves. But the ending of the Odyssey might be one of the greatest endings of all time. And the Iliad is not far behind it either. But the thing that I want to stress here is that the original audience didn't listen to find out what was going to happen. That's a very modern phenomenon. They wanted to listen because of the how. They wanted to see how this bard was going to tell the old tale again. How are they going to take the familiar and make it feel fresh? and new. And again, this is the Homeric spirit that translators seek to bring to their renderings when they try to translate Homer into English. It has been translated so many times. The question is, how can I do anything new with this story? Everybody knows the story, surely. What can I do stylistically to make it exciting? And bear in mind that these two epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are just two parts of a much larger epic cycle, a collection of ancient Greek poems that tell the full story of the Trojan War and its aftermath. The epic cycle goes far beyond what Homer covers in his works. From the 7th to the 6th centuries BCE, multiple poets, both anonymous and legendary, wrote works to complement Homer's epics. You have the Cypria, which is a prologue to the events of the Iliad. Then after the Iliad, you've got the Aethiopis, which deals with the immediate aftermath of the Trojan War. Then you've got a work that we refer to as the Little Iliad. Then we've got a work about the sack of Troy specifically that shows the Trojan horse scene. Then you've got the Nostoi, which shows the return of the other Greek heroes in the Iliad. When you come to the Odyssey, you'll note that all the other heroes have returned home. Apart from Odysseus, he's the last one left behind. Then after the Odyssey, you've got a work called the Telegony, which details the events after Odysseus' return to Ithaca, after he's dealt with those suitors. So that's important to know. But another thing to keep in mind, another lens to read Homer through, is to understand that when you are reading Homer, you are, whether you realise it or not, reading the entire Western tradition. Western literature really significantly begins with Homer, and his influence can be felt as the backbone throughout the ages. We actually read Homer today, and it's hard to believe he is as ancient as he is. The stories feel downright postmodern at times. I'm talking non-linear storytelling. I'm talking about characters who wrestle with complex moral issues. I'm talking cinematic set pieces. That's what we get from the epics. And without Homer, there's no Aeschylus, there's no Sophocles, there's no Euripides, and they would write hundreds of years after Homer, and they would take these familiar stories and characters, and they were keen to tell the old story anew in their time. They would focus on different characters whose stories are just hit upon a little bit in these epics, just a little bit, and they would take that thread and unravel it and add to the tradition. So part of the fun of reading Homer is using him to swim outwards throughout the entire tradition. It's very much like following a compelling TV series where you know all of the characters. Once you read Homer, you should go on and read the Oresteia by Aeschylus, and you'll see in that trilogy of tragedies, you'll see the fate that awaits Agamemnon, for example, and the story of his murder at the hands of his wife and the man she has been unfaithful with. It's just a side note in the Odyssey. It's just a little tonal detail that complements Telemachus' story, the thing that he's wrestling with, but we get to see it expanded. But you can't appreciate that, you cannot appreciate those works without first having a deep acquaintance with Homer. And without Homer, maybe theatre does not develop the way it developed, because Homer inspired Aeschylus. And from Aeschylus, we see character emerge. In Aeschylus' work, one character stepped forward from the chorus. And then we have Sophocles, who then added to the dramatis personae and introduced two characters. We can chart a course all the way up to Shakespeare. Shakespeare famously smashes the classical unities, but if there was nothing to smash and respond to and swerve from, then we wouldn't have what we have today. It all goes back to Homer. And we can see that all of art is a process of iteration and derivation, and Homer is the great original. This is what Harold Bloom would call the anxiety of influence. Art, like the Olympics, is agonistic, it's competitive. You have this agonistic wrestling with your precursors where you seek either to complete the work that they started, because a poet never finishes what they have to say, they always abandon their work ultimately in the middle, or they swerve from their influence. One thing you can't do, however, is write in a vacuum. You cannot dispense with your influence. They're always on your mind, and you can gleefully accept it or you can violently swerve from it. The outcome is the same. In the hands of great writers, we have new great art produced. We see at the city Dionysia in ancient Greece that playwrights would literally compete for top prize. They're all battling to ensure that they give the greatest theatrical and literary offering. This is the environment that forged great art. And everything we see in Homer's epics would become formula and almost like immutable gospel for the writers of epics that came in his wake. We see Homer's influence everywhere. Plato famously resisted Homer. He didn't like just how much of a genius his precursor was and the fact that he got there first, and so famously his Socrates would banish Homer and his epics from their utopic republic. We see that without Homer there's no Virgil, because the Aeneid is a swerving from the Homeric tradition. It is heavily indebted to it. We see that the chain of influence then goes from Homer through Virgil on to Ovid, and then continues with Dante's Divina Commedia. He was so concerned about his influence that he actually shrinked one of his precursors, Virgil, down and made him into a character in the story, simultaneously paying homage to him and honouring him, but also trying to subsume him and overcome him. He also cast Homer in there, and some of the most iconic characters in the Inferno are Homeric. So there's no Dante's Divina Commedia without Homer's epics. And this goes on from Homer through Virgil to Dante to John Milton, whose anxiety of influence is so overwhelming that he could not bear his own belatedness. And so he would take everything he learnt from Homer and sought to place himself before him. I got there first. He plays that little thought experiment. I got there before everybody, but everywhere in Paradise Lost, part of the majesty of that poem is due to the influence of his profound precursors. And then after Milton, we see just how difficult it is to write an epic, because we don't really get great epics. Now, the Romantic poets gave it a good crack. Wordsworth's The Prelude is very, very good, though it's an epic of the mind, not the battlefield. Keats had started to write Hyperion, but he died sadly before he could finish it. It's only really when we get to the late 19th century and the early 20th century that we see the epic takes another form. The epic goes from existing in poetry to being forged in prose. And we see that the next great epic is really a kind of novel, a monstrous baggy thing, as Henry James would say, and that's Tolstoy's War and Peace. After Tolstoy, we then see that the next great epic in the tradition is James Joyce's Ulysses. Yes, it's a novel, but could we really argue that what we have in this book is anything but epic? And again, Joyce demonstrates that despite Homer being thousands of years prior to him, his influence has not waned, it has not diminished. His influence is still there profoundly. And so what's a great writer to do? They must acknowledge it overtly. And we see the marks of Homer and Shakespeare everywhere in Ulysses. Indeed, Ulysses is very, very difficult to read, and you cannot unlock even a fraction of its power without an awareness of the Odyssey, because the episodes are mapped out according to the Odyssey. It takes Odysseus 10 years to return home, but in Joyce's, he subverts that and he parodies that and he makes his epic swell up over the course of just one day. And he poetically transmutes Odysseus, Telemachus and Penelope into his characters Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus and Molly Bloom. But indeed we can go even further back into the tradition of the novel form. I said that we didn't really start to see real novel stories until the rise of the novel, but we see that there's no novel without Homer either. We can go back to what many consider to be the first modern novel with Cervantes' Don Quixote in the early 17th century. There is no Don Quixote, there's no Sancho Panza, there is no quixotic sallying forth without the Odyssey. The picaresque is indebted to the Odyssey, and though Don Quixote is a satire of romance, we see that the satirical and the comic is already there in the Romantic Odyssey, that which would lead to the Romantic tradition. So if you want to read romance novels, if you want to read Alexander Dumas in the 19th century, you should have some acquaintance with Homer. Who else would we not see then without Homer? Who else is hopelessly and unavoidably indebted to Homer? Well, we do not see any of Charles Dickens's novels. What are many of his stories about? They're about striving to return home in your heart. remembering who you are, not forgetting where you came from. We do not see the Lord of the Rings in a world without Homer. There's no Lord of the Rings. That is intensely Homeric, both Iliadic and Odyssean. We don't see great movies either, like The Wizard of Oz. That is a pure return narrative that traces its way back to Homer. In fact, what we have in Homer is a grand mythic template filled with universal archetypes that always resonate. And they resonate because they give us a hero's journey, and they give us meditations on what exactly makes a hero. And I do think it is the theme of heroism primarily, and the idea of performing under pressure, performing in traumatic situations. It's the meditations on how to live virtuously, how to live with courage, how to live truthfully and with great justice. It's all of this that continues to resonate with us today and in all times. Homer's stories are everybody's stories because we are always asking ourselves, what are we fighting for? And we're always cognizant of the fact that we are fighting in the shadow of death. We're doing what we're doing with our mortality looming over us. And we're always asking ourselves, who am I? Are my actions aligned with my identity? Am I being truthful? And of course, our externalizations, how we appear to the world in the battles we fight, are just manifestations of the battle we waged first and foremost in the deepest interior of ourselves. So let's talk about heroism, and let's also delineate the differences between the two stories. Now, I'm going to hit upon some significant plot details for both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So if you haven't come to the stories before and you want them to be fresh, feel free to use the timestamps below. Feel free to skip ahead to the translation guide at the end of the video if you don't want to hear any plot details. But I would say that knowing something about the story is the best way to get into Homer and align you with those first readers. You'll be more like the first audience if you know the key players and main events, because that's how they experience the works. And indeed, if you've read some of the great books with me at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, if you've read writers like Chaucer, Shakespeare, Ovid, Dante, Joyce, Toni Morrison, then we've already hit upon Homer quite a lot. That means you're probably already somewhat familiar with these names and these ideas. But if you want to keep the surprises, then do feel free to skip ahead and join our deep dive into the books at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature, because we're going to have a lecture series and a read through over the course of the summer season. But let's give a swift rundown. In the Iliad, the Greeks and the Trojans are fighting. It's a 10-year war, and we just get to see a little bit at the end. In the 9th year, over the space of a few weeks, and with a real concentration of the span of a few days within those weeks. But the whole conflict has taken a decade. Now, why did the war start? Because the Trojan Parry abducted Helen, the queen of Sparta and the most beautiful woman in the world. He abducted her from King Menelaus, although it's left deliberately ambiguous as to how willingly she actually went with him, which adds a lot of great complexity to the character dynamics and the narrative. But the thing is, we read not just for the warring between the Trojans and the Greeks, but we read for the warring within the factions, in the Greek and Trojan camps themselves and among the allied troops. There is great tension among the anti-Trojan militia, and we say it's the Trojans versus the Greeks, but the Greek side is referred to interchangeably as being the Achaeans, the Danans and the Argives at different times. Essentially, they share no single unified name or nationality. The identity Greek is anachronistic and would not be applied to Homer's stories until the Roman era. So what we have in these epics is a ragbag collection of warriors and warrior kings who preside over palatial kingdoms, and they have come together, they've banded together with their respective troops, Achilles, for example, brings 50 fleets of 50 men apiece, and his men are the Myrmidons. Each of the men, Nestor, Odysseus, and so on, have their respective troops to command. They have banded together, and the commonality among them is that they come from southeast Thessaly in the 12th or 13th century BC. So we've got this external tension with the actual fight. And they're fighting for honour, they're fighting for glory, they're fighting because they've already been fighting so long, so they don't want to go home losers. They are dealing with sunk cost fallacy, but we'll see it is worth it for them to fight on. They are fighting for Helen of Troy, but it really is more interesting to see the infighting of the groups. And this really hits home today. Some of the greatest conflict comes among supposed friends, and the quarrel in the Greek camp really kicks off when the warlord, general and leader Agamemnon, who is the brother of Menelaus, clashes with the great warrior Achilles. Now Agamemnon is pig-headed, he's brash, he's greedy, and he is a bully of a commander, and he's clashing up against the ego of the greatest warrior of all. Achilles is a hothead, he has a quick and furious temper. He's renowned for it, and that's great if you can harness it. That's what makes him a great fighter, harnessing his rage. But it can also be deadly. It can also result in some friendly fire if you cannot harness it properly. It ends up being quite destructive. Why are they quarrelling? Well, Agamemnon publicly dishonours Achilles by taking away his war prize, a woman called Briseis. All the men have taken concubines, and Agamemnon needs to give his woman back because she is the daughter of a high priest, and this has enraged the gods above. And so he inflicts the humiliation he has felt upon Achilles. He passes it down, he makes it his problem. And what does Achilles do? He withdraws from battle, and he says, "What am I even fighting for? You're fighting for Helen. Your brother is Menelaus. That's what you're fighting for. And yes, I am fighting to help Menelaus too, but primarily, I'm fighting to win glory for myself. That's why I'm here." And this is the difference, by the way, between Greek and Roman heroes. Greek heroes have huge egos and larger-than-life personalities. It's all about their honour and their glory. Whereas if you look at the Roman heroes, if you go to Virgil's Aeneid, for example, we see that they fight primarily for their community. So it's a little bit different. Achilles says to Agamemnon, in effect, if you're going to publicly dishonour me, then what's the point of me even being here? And by the way, you need me more than I need you. So let's see how you like it when your strongest warrior drops out, and let's see how you like it when your men start dropping like flies, and then you will come crawling back to me and you will beg me to fight again, but it will be too late. So he is refusing to fight, and he's punishing his own men because of Agamemnon. If I can't receive my due glory and honour and respect, I'm going to withdraw. Now Achilles is fighting an internal battle as well. He knows that his life is destined to be short. He's not an immortal. He has an immortal divine mother, Thetis, and she dipped him in the river Styx, which conferred near invincibility upon him, but his ankle remained exposed. That's why we talk about our weakness as being our Achilles' heel. He knows his life is going to be short, but he's also wrestling with the fact that he wants his life to be heroic and he wants to be remembered. And of course, if he withdraws from the fight, then he can't be a hero. And one of the most fascinating things about these epics is wrapped around this human conflict, we see a conflict in the heavens above. And so many adaptations, film adaptations, will remove the warring gods of Mount Olympus. But to do so is a sincere error, in my opinion. The incessant quarrelling of the gods of Mount Olympus is what I personally return to these stories for. We see that the divine and godly has become domestic, and the gods are even more petty than the mortals below, whose petty squabbles are blown up to sublime and godly proportions. The battlefield below is a chessboard, and the gods above are using the humans in a proxy war to spitefully and pettily play out their bedroom politics, the two main actors being Zeus and his wife Hera. But all of the gods end up picking sides and getting angry with one another. And this ultimately plugs into a huge sweeping theme, the theme of fate, the theme of destiny, and how to live honourably and virtuously within the confines of a world that doesn't have much free will, in the confines of a world that is heavy with predestination. The overarching themes of the Iliad are man versus man versus the gods versus the gods. We can say in the place of the gods, we can say nature, we can say fate, and of course we've got the theme of man versus himself, versus his own pride. And this is why the Iliad is one of the greatest things ever written. It's important to understand that one's sense of honour in these times was everything. We get this concept of time, or honour in the ancient Greek. And time is when a hero's deeds are publicly praised. We've also got the concept of kleos, that's reputation, and that means hearing. This is essential for a man's sense of self-worth. So Achilles' wrath arises from the fact that he has been dishonoured. The word for insult or unjust public humiliation is lobe. So a hero does these famous deeds. We talk of Clea Andron, the famous deeds of men. How do you bestow honour on such a hero? Well, you give them prizes publicly. They are fighting for material reward, geras. They're fighting for concubines, for women, for example. The men are fighting for women. And so what's a great way to dishonour one? Publicly humiliate them, strip them of their prize, and of course, a hero like Achilles cannot take that. He cannot just swallow the affront and press on. He's got a reputation, so he's been put in a difficult position, and so he withdraws. And his absence becomes a profound presence. And we see that the Greeks definitely do need Achilles. We see that they go and implore him. Ajax and Odysseus, who in the Roman tradition is referred to as Ulysses, by the way, they implore him to fight, but he refuses. It's only when his dear friend, Patroclus, is murdered in battle. He borrows his armour, presenting himself as Achilles, and he's cut down by the Trojan Hector. This is when Achilles finally kicks into gear, because we see that now he has something to fight for. This is a book about fighting, yes, but it's also a book about not fighting, and it's a book that asks the question, what are we fighting for? Now we see Agamemnon and Achilles do make their peace. There is a complexity to them. Agamemnon does ultimately feel bad about what he has done, and Achilles also has to deal with the guilt of his withdrawal, leading to the deaths of countless men. And there are so many deaths in the Iliad. There are 240 named dead and countless more unnamed. The book is saturated with blood, and the Iliad builds to this incredible battle scene when he returns. Now he has something to fight for. And what makes a Homeric hero? Well, they have to honour their forefathers. And I think this is a good definition of God. We see the gods feature heavily in these epics. Gods, in Homer's universe, God is that which inspires you to act courageously and honour your mother and your father. Whatever makes you do that is God in Homer's universe. A Homeric hero honours their parents and their forefathers. They solicit the attention of the immortals above. They have a divine aspect to their lineage, but most importantly of all, they are mortal and they can and will die. If you cannot risk your life, then you are not a hero. So the heroes are godlike, but not gods. And it's really important that they do die as a result of courageous endeavours. It is heroic to die in battle. And when a Homeric hero enters a battle, it goes like this. He dons his armour, he fights valiantly, he kills and causes panic in the enemies. Then the hero calls upon the gods, he swears an oath, and then what we see is a one-on-one fight. We see these duels, and before the duel there's a long speech back and forth on either side, and then they engage one another, and when a hero cuts down his enemy, he strips them of their armour and takes the spoils from that murder. Another marker of a Homeric hero is that they are emotional. It's not just rage. In fact, I've said before that male rage is a mask for something more complex, emotions that are more difficult to deal with. We see that Homeric heroes weep. They weep over causes dear to them. So when Patroclus dies, Achilles weeps, and this fuels his anger. And he knows ultimately that as a hero, that means he's destined to die. He's not destined to have a quiet life back at home and to die in old age in his sleep. No, he's going to die in the clash and sting of battle. And in classical thought, heroes really were dead, not living. Hero, which in Greek means protector or defender, a hero was somebody who had died. Now, the troops, the men, Achilles and Odysseus and so on, they are determined as heroes, they're referred to as heroes, but it is important to understand that your heroic status is somewhat up in the air until you've passed away. Once you die, your legacy is secured and your exploits and adventures can pass into legend. Whilst you're still living, it's all up in the air, and I suppose we've always been aware of that cliche that you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become a villain, or you see yourself wane. So heroes want to die in battle. Now, why do heroes resonate with us? Because they're archetypical, and they are the most ancient, enduring, and ubiquitous and pervasive myth. They are an ideal personified, and indeed their journey, we can map out their journey. Joseph Campbell mapped out the hero's journey sublimely. He spoke of the monomyth. We see it time and again. From Homeric stories to the stories of scripture, we see it over and over again, and the reason why the hero's journey resonates with us is because, as I've said, we're always on our own hero's journey. Joseph Campbell would delineate the narrative of the hero's journey into 3 overarching stages, and this would become the foundation for romance. The first stage is the departure, then you've got an initiation, and then you've got a return. So we can see that the Iliad is a quest narrative, it's a quarrel narrative, you've got the heat of battle, and then the Odyssey is the return portion of the story. And within these stages exist a bunch of sub-stages: the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, solicitation of a supernatural aid, going down a road of trials. We'll talk about all of this, and we'll talk about all the traits of the archetypical hero in our lecture series at Patreon. But ultimately, the hero's journey builds and builds and builds and reaches a point of apotheosis. They get to a realization about themselves. And so we see time and again, and this is what we resonate with, the external conflicts are important primarily for what they give rise to internally. Where we end up at the end of a journey is where we began, but we have changed and we see the world differently. And so the value of these stories is in their mythic resonance, which begs the question, how much is myth and how much is actually history? We should note that for the longest time there wasn't the kind of strong delineation between myth and history that we get in the modern era. Early historians like Herodotus would consider personages like Helen of Troy to be historical figures, and they considered the Trojan War to be a real event. Myth and legend and story was, in a sense, history, and listening to these epics was a way of sharing in a communal experience, a reliving of a shared past. The stories were entertainment, yes, but there was an element of worship thrown in too. You get these reflections upon morality and mortality. They are portable ways of considering ethics, but they were also considered to be somewhat like historical records. Now, Auerbach would tell us that to write history is so difficult that most historians are forced to make concessions to the technique of legend. If you look to the etymology of the word history, you can see that many of the most important things that history does, myth does too. If you go all the way back in the etymology, history comes from the word to mean wise man. But then the word in ancient Greek takes on the meaning of inquiry and narrative. So a history is a narrative that makes inquiries. Inquiries into what? Truth. And myth does contain truth. Does it contain empirical, factual truth about things that really happened? Maybe, sometimes, a little bit. Does it contain poetic truth? Yes, that's the truth it contains. In oral storytelling culture, with no widespread way of committing ideas to printed record, myth was a way of encoding history, and you can encode things by embellishing and swelling and introducing hyperbole. So in our myths, there is a kernel of historical truth, but they've been swelled up and visualized and symbolized so that they endure and are passed down, and the most important thing gets remembered, which is the message on how to live. So is the Iliad poetically true only, or did the Trojan War actually take place? This is a fascinating question that has gripped scholars for ages, and a really key significant finding came from a German businessman, amateur archaeologist and lifelong lover of Homer called Heinrich Schliemann. By the time we get to the 19th century, the idea that Homer was detailing real historical events was not taken seriously at all. But Schliemann was convinced that there had to be historical truth in there, so he set out to prove it. He followed geographical clues within the Iliad to a place called Hexameter in modern-day northwestern Turkey, and his excavations, which were really damaging, he used dynamite to blow parts of the earth apart. He used really aggressive and destructive digging methods, so it wasn't great. But his excavations from 1870 through to 1890 were really revolutionary because they revealed multiple layers of cities built on top of one another. We're talking 9 major layers, each representing an exciting stage of development and settlement from 3000 BC to the Roman eras. He discovered caches of gold and beautiful artifacts, which he would call the treasure of Priam, believing it to have belonged to the king of Priam. And then he smuggled all of this out of Turkey, wrapped in his wife's shawl. Analysis would later reveal that the treasure was from far too early an era to have lined up with the Troy of Homer's epics, but he did prove the existence of a historical Troy. Did he manage to prove that there was a decade-long battle there, though? No, that has not been proven. However, there is evidence to suggest that a fire raged through the city at one point. There is evidence to suggest that a hasty evacuation did take place in the late Bronze Age, and we do see signs of violence. And so we might say there's no record of a 10-year-long battle. Now, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but there is some evidence to show that conflict did take place there, and if myth encodes history via embellishment, then we might say that the story, the battle, was blown up a little bit in order to endure. We see this all the time. With each retelling of a story, we add little more details, don't we? We might think of Falstaff, who gets jumped near Eastcheap whilst he's trying to steal some purses, and when he retells the story, he introduces more and more men. It goes from just a few men were attacking him to suddenly there was 100 men. He was taking them all on. Imagine this, but at scale and over the course of hundreds of years. And some scholars have actually analysed records from modern-day Turkey, and they have found records from the Hittite people of West Asia, that's Anatolia, under King Alexander, and they found that there was indeed a conflict between them and another regional power that could have been the Achaeans. So Schliemann made an exciting discovery. Troy was a real place and there are signs of violence, but the poet of Homer's epics did not have Schliemann's architectural discoveries to go on, so he would have known about this from stories passed down orally through the generations. Now, we've detailed the Iliad, so let's quickly talk about the story of the Odyssey. And I personally prefer the Odyssey. I love them both, but I prefer the Odyssey, though it's worth again stressing that the Odyssey is all the more impactful when you've read the Iliad first. When the Odyssey opens, it has been 10 years since the Trojan War ended. In total, Odysseus has been away from home for 20 years, away from his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, who was an infant when he left and has now grown up. During that time, suitors have moved in on Odysseus's territory, and they are aggressively petitioning Penelope for her hand in marriage, and these people are the absolute worst. They are eating them out of house and home. They are rowdy, they're drinking, they're dancing and singing all night, and they're getting angry with Penelope for stalling them. Not only that, but they are planning to murder Telemachus. Now, they think that Odysseus is already dead, so they just need to get rid of his son. Odysseus is in fact on the island of Ogygia, and he's being kept there by the seductive goddess Calypso. And finally, after a council of the gods, we see that Athena successfully gets Zeus to order Calypso to release him so that he can return home. Meanwhile, Athena instructs Telemachus to set out and find news of his father from the other leaders who have successfully returned from Troy. This opening is incredible because it is non-linear, and Odysseus' return is very nascent. But then we get to see everything that has happened on his journey by virtue of embedded storytelling. This is an epic eminently concerned with the art of storytelling. Singing bards are seen as divinely inspired, and there are constant visual metaphors of weaving, spinning yarns, and that's a stand-in symbolically for the threads of fate, but also the threads of story, weaving a story and telling a compelling yarn. The fact that the opening of this epic begins with most of the adventures behind Odysseus and with a focus on Ithaca, that does some really important things. It emphasises the fact that return, or nostos, homecoming, is central to this epic. What we get to see from the outset is the struggle for a young man to grow up without his father and, in a sense, become like his father, step into his shoes. And then with his father's return, we see that he fights alongside him and he's learning to honour him. And delaying all of the adventures and really focusing on what's going on in Ithaca dials up our anger at the suitors. It builds outrage. So by the time we get to the climax, it feels glorious when they're taken care of. By virtue of backwards recall, we see that Odysseus the Wanderer has been blown off course by Poseidon because he blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and as such, he's blown over to different lands, different cultures, he meets different people, and he has to live as a stranger for many years. We see one of the most recurring ancient concepts in the Odyssey is that of xenia, or xenia, hospitality. It's really important that you make your guest feel welcome. We get this meditation on how do you make a stranger feel at home. You can only do that so far, but you only have one real home, and home is where the heart is, and it's very tough living as a stranger without your family, without the ones you love. Again, we are seeing the cost of war, the high price that men have to pay for fighting their wars. Fighting for who they love often means leaving who they love behind. It's a painful irony. And as Odysseus is a stranger, we see that he's constantly wrestling with identity. This epic makes us appreciate our home and where we came from. It implores us to never forget who we are. And so identity and homecoming are intricately tied together. And so is the theme of transformation, because we are always asking ourselves, who are we in a world of constant flux? The only thing that remains the same is change. What of us remains static and stable as we strive to return home? Odysseus is a man who's described as wily. He knows many tricks and strategies. He's described as polytropos, a man of many turns, and the stock epithet for Odysseus is polymaitis, the man of many wiles. This is a man who knows how to utilise a disguise to get what he wants and in order to survive. He is the man behind the Trojan horse strategy after all, and we might think that he has been wearing a disguise for so long, he's been away from home for so long, a stranger for so long, that it would be understandable if he struggled to know who he really is at times. And the entire saga, the hero's journey, can be read as a spiritual inner quest to stay true to who you are. There is also a very symbolic descent into the underworld midway through the quest that signifies the Odyssey as a rebirth narrative. If you are in dire need of being reborn, losing something of yourself to really truly find who you are, if you need a death and rebirth, then reading the Odyssey will aid you there. One of the best scenes in the Odyssey is that blinding scene, which causes him all kinds of trouble. He blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus, and he sticks him in the eye with a heated stick, and he tells the Cyclops that his name is no man. So when the Cyclops cries out to the other monsters on the island, "Help, help, no man has blinded me," of course they do not come and help. Odysseus is the everyman who has to pretend to be no man. And that speaks right to the heart of the human condition, man or woman. I think we all feel like we're playing that game, we're striking that balance from time to time. And I think that men are either an Achilles or they are an Odysseus, but that will change depending on the season of your life. You're either filled with rage and anger and trying to work out how to channel and harness it, or you are learning to strategize. You're learning to have some cunning and to get by without so much violence. Yes, the journey home is a voyage from hell, but we see so many fantastic adventures that help to tell Odysseus who he is. Some of the adventures include travelling through the land of the lotus eaters, dealing with the cannibals. We see his men greedily open the bag of wind from Aeschylus, and they think that there's gold in there, but their own pride and recklessness blows them off course even further. We see also, due to their own recklessness, that they are transformed into pigs on the island of Circe. We see that the men need to chart a course between Scylla and Charybdis after passing the sirens whose song is deadly. And then we finally get to the scene that we anticipate all the way through, when the men slaughter the cattle of the sun god. They were told not to, but do they listen? Do they? Hell. We're always telling the same story. The story of the fall of mankind, the fall of Lucifer, the fall of Icarus. We see that this is a story not only about getting home and healing and honouring who we are, but it's a story about pride and coming up against our sense of pride. The meditations on identity continue even when Odysseus returns home, because the next challenge is integrating back into this world that he has left behind, and we see strikingly that he dons the clothing of a beggar. This is a really powerful and enduring romantic stock trope. The royal reversal. We see the highborn and godlike, the heroic, in the common or lowly guise. This is a symbolic signifier for the fact that heroism is an inward quality and not conditional on how we appear. The most heartbreaking scenes in this saga are scenes of recognition. The one that really touches me at the moment is when Odysseus' faithful dog, Argos, recognises his master. He's been waiting for him for years and years, and when he finally sees him home, he dies from the relief. And of course you've got the recognition and the reveal scene with father and son. And father and son and swineherd and one of the household staff, they team up, and what they give us is a powerful climax that is like peak Tarantino filmmaking from ancient Greece. We get a lesson in how to deliver an extraordinary payoff when we see Odysseus finally reclaim his home and identity and family in a banquet of blood. So that's a really rough overview of the story. It's just good to have some knowledge of the story beats, because then you will be like the first reader, and we're going to go much deeper into these stories at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. The experience of reading Homer is a really deeply moving one. I personally love just how sophisticated the narrative is, and it is my contention that for all the sublimity of Homer, there's also great comedy running through the work. Great tragedy, yes, but there is a comic substance there too. Not only in the Odyssey, yes, there are moments of farce in the Odyssey, maybe not to Ovidian levels, but there is the farcical, there's slapstick, there's lowbrow humour, of course there's sophisticated wordplay, but there's comedy in the Iliad too, and I would contend that one of the keys to appreciating the Iliad is to read it through the lens of irony, and read both works as powerful character studies and use them to penetrate to the core of what it means to be human. You'll find along the way, when you really bring yourself to these epics, that you'll develop fondness for particular characters outside of the central protagonists. I personally love Nestor, I love Eumaeus, I love Athena, I also like Telemachus, and different aspects of the story will resonate with you in different times. I love how intensely visual the epics are. Yes, they have melopic power, of course they do. It's Homer, that's what he's renowned for. But they're incredibly cinematic, in my opinion too, if you're working with the right translation. And that takes us into the next thing to consider, and perhaps the most important thing to consider. What is the best translation of Homer? Picking the right translation is absolutely paramount, because the difference between a good and a bad translation is the difference between inhaling the work excitedly and then rereading it all the days of your life, or just casting it aside, becoming weary with it and giving up and finding it frustrating. That's the difference the right translation can make. And finding the right translation may even give you the spark of inspiration to learn Homeric Greek. But you need to have the story first. Courses and books on ancient Greek implore you to read it in English first. Now, I do not believe that there is a right or wrong translation. I don't personally buy into gatekeeping or academic pretension when it comes to translation, nor did James Joyce. He recommended his family members read an illustrated children's version of the Odyssey before reading Ulysses. The right translation is the one that gets you into the work and keeps you reading it. Some readers like to have multiple translations on hand at the same time. I noticed this when we read Dante at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, because indeed there's a range in styles, so having 2 or 3 on hand means you get something different from each of them. John Rutherford, my favourite translator of Don Quixote, would class translators into 2 camps. They are either Puritans or Cavaliers. If you're a puritanical translator, then you are ultra faithful on a word by word and syntactical level, whereas if you're a more Cavalier, then you're a bit more loose and you're trying to render the feeling of Homer, for example, into English. What would Homer sound like if he had been English? And a great translator is a real artisan. They have to be a poet in both languages, so definitely don't underestimate the power of a great translation. It's really impressive when someone forges a great translation. With all that being said, the best way to pick the translation that you like is to do a taste test. Let's do a contrast and compare of some of my personal favourites. I'm not able to narrow it down to just one because all of the translations give you something different. And indeed, here's a lifelong reading assignment for you. Read a new translation of Homer every year, or every other year, so you always get the story again in a new way, and keep up to date with which translations are coming out, the new translations. It's a great way to structure your rereading over the years. But if you do want me to narrow it down to just one, let's begin with the translation that I'm personally going to be using for the Hardcore Literature Book Club lecture series, and that is the Stanley Lombardo translation of both the Odyssey and the Iliad. Lombardo's translations from the late 90s and early noughties are the clearest I have found. They are so crisp and so easy to read that you will feel like you're watching a movie. Lombardo, who has translated many classical works. He's translated Ovid. His Metamorphoses is a real gem too. He originally put together his translations for performance. He was giving one-man performances of Homer and he needed a script. So his translations are really in the spirit of the original oral tradition. If I wanted to recommend a translation that had the likelihood of converting the most amount of people into lovers of Homer, or getting the most amount of people through the epics, I would recommend the Lombardo. He's good for everybody, particularly if you've not read a lot of classical literature. If you feel like the classical tradition is cut off to you, you will be very, very surprised, pleasantly surprised, when it comes to Lombardo, because he's just easy to read. So here's Lombardo, and this is from Book 9 of the Iliad, around 420 lines in, and the speaker is Achilles. Cattle and flocks are there for the taking. You can always get tripods and chestnut horses. Tripod, by the way, that's a golden cauldron. So he's talking about war prizes, taking powerful stallions, horses. He's talking about taking prizes from the sacking of Troy. You can always get those, but a man's life cannot be won back once his breath has passed beyond his clenched teeth. My mother Thetis, a moving silver grace, tells me 2 fates sweep me on to my death. If I stay here and fight, I'll never return home, but my glory will be undying forever. If I return home to my dear fatherland, my glory is lost, but my life will be long, and death that ends all will not catch me soon. That's the Lombardo. Now let's take a look at the Robert Fagles. Fagles' translations from the 90s are incredibly poetic, and there is a surging dramatic power to his verse. His Homer is pulsing with energy, and his renderings are incredibly vibrant. Emerson would say of Montaigne, if you cut his words they would bleed. Well, that's how I feel about Fagles, and many readers agree, as Fagles has long been a popular go-to choice for schools and book clubs alike. Let's see how he does the same passage. Here's the Fagles. Cattle and fat sheep can all be had for the raiding. tripods all for the trading, and tawny-headed stallions. But a man's life breath cannot come back again. No raiders in force, no trading brings it back, once it slips through a man's clenched teeth. Mother tells me, the immortal goddess Thetis with her glistening feet, that two fates bear me on to the day of death. If I hold out here and I lay siege to Troy, my journey home is gone, but my glory never dies. If I voyage back to the fatherland I love, my pride, my glory dies. True, but the life that's left me will be long. The stroke of death will not come on me quickly. So that's Fagles. What do you make of that one? It's nice, isn't it? Let's compare with the Richmond Lattimore, and I really love all of these translations, they're all amazing. Lattimore translated Homer in the 50s and 60s, and his translations have a really austere, formal quality to them. Lattimore was aiming to render the Homeric dignity into English, and he favoured a more literal approach. So he keeps a lot of the original Homeric imagery and word choice. All of that's intact, even in translation, and that makes him an excellent choice for academic study. Here's the Lattimore. Of possessions, cattle and fat sheep are things to be had for the lifting, and tripods can be won, and the tawny high heads of horses. But a man's life cannot come back again. It cannot be lifted nor captured again by force once it has crossed the teeth's barrier. For my mother Thetis, the goddess of the silver feet, tells me I carry two sorts of destiny toward the day of my death. Either, if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone. But there will be a long life left for me, and my end in death will not come to be quickly. Alright, let's check out another one. This is the Robert Fitzgerald. And Fitzgerald, Fagles, Lattimore, these have been favourites of mine at different times. Fitzgerald translated Homer in the 60s and 70s, and his translations are a little more loose. He strove to strike a balance between elegance in English and fidelity to the original. Fitzgerald's translations are incredibly readable. They're smooth and they're poetic, they're very lyrical. Let's see how he does it, and let's vary it up a little bit with a different passage. How does Fitzgerald render the opening of the Iliad? Anger be now your song, immortal one. Achilles' anger, doomed and ruinous, that caused the Achaeans loss on bitter loss, and crowded brave souls into the undergloom, leaving so many dead men, carrion for dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was done. Begin it, when the two men first contending broke with one another, the Lord Marshal, Agamemnon, Atreus' son, and Prince Achilles. Let's keep it going a little bit longer. We also have the recent translations from Emily Wilson, who sought after clarity and minimalism, and she also wished to confront and overcome translation biases involving gender. With her Odyssey, she takes an epic that already feels, to me at least, already feels quite feminine and female-centric, despite the male hero, and she really leans into that. Keeping with the same opening that we just saw from Fitzgerald, here's Emily Wilson. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain, and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades, and made men the spoil of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. These translations are poetic. But what about prose translations? Well, when it comes to prose, you cannot beat the E.V. Rio, which has become a real classic in its own right and was used for the longest time very widely in schools. And underneath the more contemporary translations, we typically find a great indebtedness to Ryu and also Fagles, who are like polar opposites in their approaches. If you want to read Homer's epics like compelling, gripping novels, then go for E.V. Rio's prose renderings. Here's his Iliad. Anger Sing, goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that accursed anger, which brought the Greeks endless sufferings, and sent the mighty souls of many warriors to Hades, leaving their bodies as carrions for the dogs, and a feast for the birds. And Zeus's purpose was fulfilled. It all began when Agamemnon, lord of men, and godlike Achilles quarrelled and parted. Now, very recently, there's been a lot of hype about the Daniel Mendelssohn translation of the Odyssey, and it's said that he is currently working on the Iliad too. Mendelssohn taught Homer for many years, and his translation is astonishing. He sought to refresh reader perceptions and find a way to tell the old tale anew, and he made so many genius stylistic choices. If you go for the Mendelssohn, read his introduction and read his note on his translation. It's really interesting, and pay attention to what he does with character names. Mendelssohn makes the Odyssey feel like a brand new work. The lines are winding and they're like little sagas in themselves, and they feel very stately and Homeric. Here's the Odyssey, not the Iliad. Book 3, opening lines from Mendelssohn. Leaving the splendid waters behind, the sun sprang up into a sky of beaten bronze, so he could shine for the immortals and for mortals, doomed to die on the earth which yields life-giving grain. Meantime they came to Pylos, the city of Neleus, crowded with buildings, while at the seashore the people were sacrificing jet-black bulls to Earthshaker, he of the blue-black mane. And let's end with one more. You could also check out the George Chapman translations. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and his was the very first translation of Homer into English. It was his translation that would inspire the Romantic poets. You might think of Keats's poem On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. If you like a little bit of Elizabethan flair, and you like some heroic couplets, and you're interested in having translation history built into your appreciation, then Chapman's Homer, just like Golding's Ovid, might be a good choice for you. Here's the same passage for contrast with Mendelssohn's. Helios, leaving behind the lovely standing waters, rose up into the brazen sky to shine upon the immortals, and also on mortal men across the grain-giving farmland. They came to Pylos, Neleus' strong-founded citadel, where the people on the shore of the sea were making sacrifice of bulls who were all black to the dark-haired Earthshaker. Now, this is not an exhaustive list at all. There are so many other great avenues to go down. For another prose translation, you might like the Samuel Butler. For a rather archaic sounding but classic English poetic translation, there's the Alexander Pope. For another modern translation, there's the Peter Green. There are so many, so I really do encourage you to taste test more if you're still wavering on the one that's right for you. And let us know which one you liked the sound of the most. I'd be really interesting to take a little bit of a poll on that. Now, are there any more quick tips that I can give you to make the most of your Homer? Yes. The first thing that I would implore you to do is when you read Homer, make a real meal out of your journey. That means get yourself some maps and atlases of these ancient locales. Trace your finger along them as the names are mentioned in the epics. Go down Homeric rabbit holes. Listen to music inspired by the epics. Watch documentaries. Watch film adaptations. Follow the resources that I put each week in the post for the lectures at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. And speaking of the book club, make your reading communal. Homer was not just oral culture, but he was community entertainment. So read Homer aloud to yourself. If you're by yourself, you might read it under your breath, but read it to others too. Share your favourite passages, and also clarify your thoughts as you move through. That means you might want to journal. It means underline things and do marginalia. If you want to see my journaling and marginalia approach, I have a video on this channel that you can check out. Take your copies everywhere with you. Dog-ear them, batter them, take them out and about, always have them with you. Treat them like scripture. Treat them the way Alexander the Great did when he went on his military campaigns. But join the conversation at the book club. See what other readers are saying about the episodes you've just enjoyed. Discuss the books with fellow lovers of literature, and follow the lecture series over the course of summer. Here's the pacing for the book club, for the lectures. We are going to read Homer's Iliad all the way through. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a little symbolic deload to allow Homer's themes to digest and percolate. And after the Iliad, we're going to come forward in time a little bit, and we're going to enjoy a writer that is very Homeric, very indebted to Homer, and that is Alexander Dumas. We're going to read the Iliad. Then we're going to read The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas, and indeed we've read The Count of Monte Cristo before. It ranks as one of the most popular read-throughs we've ever done, and there's a lot of hype for The Three Musketeers. I'm really excited to read this one with book club members, and it's going to help clarify some of those Homeric themes, and we're just going to enjoy a real swashbuckling quest romance. It's going to be great. Once we've read The Three Musketeers all the way through, it will then feel like there's a little gap between the sacking of Troy and our returning home, and then we're going to read the Odyssey all the way through. Overall, this is going to take us over the course of about 3 months. It's going to take us across the summer season, and lectures come out each and every weekend. For your next reading assignment and for the parts of the book that we're covering in our next lecture this weekend coming at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, please check out the resources section for this post at patreon.com/hardcore literature. If you can read a book per day. There are 24 books in the Iliad and also the Odyssey. A book a day will keep the doctor away. You'll have a book a day most of the week, and then come Sunday read an extra book. So we'll be clocking about 8 books per week. If you can do that, you'll be keeping in line with when the lectures come out, but do feel free to go at your own pace. Once the lectures go out, they're always there, and we also have an extensive back catalogue of well over 600 posts, long-form lectures on the great books. We have covered writers like Shakespeare, Ovid, Chaucer, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Dante, Lady Murasaki, Jane Austen, Herman Melville, and many more. So whilst many readers do like to keep in line roughly with when the lectures come out, there are many readers who also like to juggle a couple of different books, go into the back catalogue, and go at the pace that best suits their life right now. And I would like to end today by saying thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here with me and sharing your great love of literature. You're keeping the great books alive, and for that I'm eternally grateful. And I would love to know your experience with Homer. Are you gearing up for your first reading? If so, what are you anticipating? What are you looking forward to? What challenges do you foresee? What are you expecting? And if this is a rereading, what are you looking forward to? What would you like to get out of your reading this time around? What advice would you give other readers to facilitate a meaningful experience? And again, thank you so much. I appreciate you, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.